This year, Ubuntu celebrated its 20th anniversary, and yes, if you're around the same age as me, you probably started using Ubuntu almost at the time when it was introduced, and 20 years feels absolutely crazy. But I thought that today we could take a look at why Ubuntu earned a special place in the world of Linux distributions, why it still holds the hearts of a lot of Linux users, but also what happened to it, the highs, the lows, and where they stand currently. And we'll also look at our sponsor, of course. This video is sponsored by TuxCare. You probably know them by now if you're a regular viewer of the channel. They provide a full suite of solutions to ensure your Linux fleet stays as secure and up-to-date as possible, while reducing downtime to a minimum, of course. This includes rebootless patching solutions, which apply fixes to critical pieces of your Linux environment, like the kernel, shared libraries, and virtualization systems, all without needing to reboot or to cause any disruptions. TuxCare also offers extended support for end-of-life distros, languages, and software development frameworks like Spring. And this time they're actually asking you for your feedback in a little survey that will only take about 15 minutes of your time, and it will let you weigh in on how you work with Linux in an enterprise context. All answers are used to build the freely available yearly report that TuxCare publishes about the state of enterprise Linux to determine the trends and evolutions of our open source strategies going into 2025. And answering the survey will enter you into a prize drawing where you get the chance to win a $500 Amazon gift card, a $300 Lego set, and other prizes. Obviously, the link to the survey is in the description. If you work in a Linux enterprise context, now is the time to let them know how you actually use Linux. Don't miss the chance to enter this easy giveaway as well. Okay, so let's begin with the Ubuntu release that started it all, Ubuntu 4.10. Now, Ubuntu 4.10 was kind of revolutionary at the time. It was started by Mark Shuttleworth, a millionaire, maybe even billionaire, but I think millionaire. It was started as a community plus benevolent, self-appointed dictator sort of project. Now, personally, I did not use that specific version. I started a little bit later, but this one was pretty great. First, it used a live CD, which wasn't necessarily something that every distro did back in those days. For example, Fedora only managed to have their first live CDs in 2007, about 3 years after Ubuntu. This was when the first orange/brownish tones appeared for Ubuntu. As you can see here, all the highlights, all the theme, all the menus, the wallpaper, everything was brown, earthy, coffee, and I honestly really loved those colors. Ubuntu came with accessibility tools by default, which wasn't necessarily something that a lot of distributions had back in those days either, and you had a bunch of pre-installed applications that you sort of needed to get started with a computer, notably an Office suite, at the time OpenOffice, not LibreOffice, a help center, and a bunch of media and internet-related stuff as well. This wasn't the norm either on all distributions. The idea was, let's make a Linux desktop that is as simple, as easy to use, and comes with all the tools that you need by default without needing any specific manual configuration, additional install, or anything. And this version sort of accomplished that, but it's not the one that put Ubuntu on the radar. Next came 5.04 and 5.10. Those were two releases that mainly just updated the base and refined the rough edges of the first version of Ubuntu. It also gained OEM install support, integration with Ubuntu's development tool called Launchpad, and those are the versions that started really making people notice Ubuntu, and this paved the way to the first LTS, the long-term support. It was called Dapper Drake Ubuntu 6.04, or as a matter of fact 6.06, because it had to be pushed 2 months to be as solid as could be. As far as I remember, this is the only version that ever was pushed from its initial release date, but they just needed a little extra time to make sure that this first stable release that they would offer a lot of support for was as solid and as good as possible. And this is actually the first version of Linux and of Ubuntu that I ever used, and the one that made me fall in love with Linux in general. Now, this version brought a new theme. It was more orange than brown. You also had a new graphical installer, which was interesting because at the time you mostly had terminal-based installers, which could be visual, but they weren't graphical, as in use your mouse to click on stuff. The live CD also was the install CD now. Both of them were fused, which again at the time wasn't necessarily something everyone was doing. And 6.06 was the first version that could upgrade from a previous release with a graphical tool. Basically, Dapper Drake was the version that really started it all. It was the most stable one. It was what defined the Ubuntu desktop for about 2 years. And it was a major one in the entire Linux desktop landscape because, again, it tried to bridge that gap between a system that was very technical and still needed a lot of manual work and general users that just wanted to install something in a few clicks and have a usable PC. And it did it well. Then came 6.10, 7.04, and 7.10. Those were 3 intermediary releases that led up to Ubuntu 8.04 Hardy Heron, which was a fantastic release. This is when I really started using Linux in earnest. I started actually with 6.6, but mostly 6.10, and by 7.04 I had moved to Linux entirely, no more Windows partition, and I only used Linux every day. I upgraded through every new release on the day of release, or sometimes even moving to the betas instead, and it was a super exciting time where you basically had so much cool stuff in every new version. You felt on the bleeding edge of things. For example, here you had the opportunity to install specific drivers and codecs with specific tools to do just that. You had the beginning of compiz and visual effects that you could do. You had desktop search that was kind of fast now with actual good tools. You had graphical tools to configure certain x.org options. You had a full graphical installer. You had support for the NTFS file system. And Hardy Heron, Ubuntu 8.04, came with Pulse Audio for the first time, which handled all the sound on Linux for a long while. It supported Active Directory for Windows, and it supported even the Woobi installer, which lets you install Ubuntu inside of Windows as a single file distro. It was pretty revolutionary. This is a version that I used for a long while because it's the one I gave my mom on the family computer, and she kept it way past the distro's expiration date and never really complained about it. She used it for a teaching job, for writing documents, printing them, and preparing the activities that she did with her kids, and it worked really well. Not a complaint until she bought a new computer that went Windows, and then she started calling me again. And after 8.04, that's when Ubuntu really started making changes to the default GNOME experience. They brought brand new indicators that regrouped some information and centered it in your desktop instead of having to open apps to see those informations. You also had a push towards services. Ubuntu introduced Ubuntu One, which obviously doesn't run anymore today, but this was a service that lets you sync your files to the cloud between devices or just store backups of your files. But obviously, yeah, it's pretty buggy today. It's just not working. The server doesn't exist anymore. Now in 9.10 they also introduced a new theme that went back to that sort of brownish tones, which I kinda liked as a departure from the previous one in 8.04. You also had ext4 as the file system, which was the first time I think that it was used in Ubuntu, and it's still the default file system for a whole lot of distributions today. And this time period is also when Ubuntu started the 100 paper cuts project, which basically is trying to identify all the little issues that take not much time to fix and fix them in priority to make sure that the experience doesn't feel as complicated, doesn't have as many little small sticking points or nagging issues. And then came Lucid Links, or 10.04, the next LTS, and probably one of my favorite versions of Ubuntu, one that I remember really fondly. They kept pushing what they tried to do with their own differentiation. For example, you had that little session user, which lets you set up all your accounts, your online accounts, much like you can do today in GNOME. You had more indicators with more support. They really refined the experience, and they brought a brand new theme that I found was the pinnacle of design at the time. Now, obviously, today it looks a bit dated, but it's still pretty neat. You had this sort of brown, tan, black, white, and orange content, which worked really well. It was a controversial version, mostly due to the placement of these buttons, really mimicking macOS, and the use of that purple at the time also sort of evoked macOS, so people started thinking that maybe Ubuntu was trying to copy macOS a bit too much, but it was still an absolutely fantastic release, and I really loved using it with the default theme. I thought it looked so elegant and so cool compared to everything that you could use back in the day. This version was the start of the maybe identity crisis of Ubuntu. They had refined GNOME as a desktop. They had a solid experience that, in my opinion, was just much better than anything else you could use at the time. But also they didn't really know where they wanted to go, I think. And so they started experimenting with something that, yes, looked more and more like macOS with every version. And this culminated in Ubuntu 11.04. 11.04 introduced Unity, the whole new desktop environment, or at least desktop shell for Ubuntu. You might notice this is not Ubuntu 11.04, and that's because Unity, when it was introduced, was an absolute shit show of a desktop. It didn't work, it was slow, buggy, horrendous to use, and VMs even completely refused to run it whatsoever. Why would Ubuntu start their own desktop? That was because what was shown at the time of GNOME 3 sucked big time. It looked like a complete departure of what people were used to, and Ubuntu decided that this was not the experience they wanted to offer their users. Sticking to GNOME 2 was not an option either, it was going to be deprecated, so they built their own thing, which was Unity. The first version was absolutely horrendous, but by the time you had 11.10, 12.04, it really worked well. And it was very macOS inspired. Again, you had a global menu bar for every app. Ubuntu even maintained their own patched versions of specific apps, like for example LibreOffice, to have access to that menu up top. Firefox was also patched to support this, and this is something a lot of people would really kill for today. Still, Unity, by the time it was fully fleshed out 2 or 3 releases afterwards, was actually really good. You had a full system search, you had document search, you had lenses for your various file types, which were really cool. You could filter a bunch of things, it looked great. It also had access to the HUD, which lets you search through the menus over there. You had the new Ubuntu font that was added, a bunch of stuff. It really felt like Ubuntu had its own identity now, and I loved it, even though, yes, it is utterly broken in a VM today. But after 12.04 came what I like to call the dumb moves era, an era where Ubuntu started really completely losing its grip on how big it was, what it could actually accomplish, and what its main focus should have been. It should have been the desktop. Ubuntu was a desktop distro first and foremost. This was why people really loved it, and it has a solid server component. That was what people were expecting. But Ubuntu decided to do something completely different. First, Ubuntu added this lovely piece of adware inside of the desktop, which opened an Amazon browser, and it also actually sent all your searches from the Unity dash to Amazon for a long while until they added the option to disable it, which obviously wasn't well received. Ubuntu also started trying to build their own display server. They wanted to replace X11, but instead of working on Wayland, which was the widely accepted solution that everyone was starting to look at back in those days, they tried building their own thing, which was called Mir. It never appeared in any version of Ubuntu desktop because it never was completed, because turns out it's a lot of work to build your own display server on your own, even if you are called Ubuntu and you're one of the most use distribution. Nowadays, obviously, Mir still exists as something for IoT, but also obviously Ubuntu moved to Wayland because why develop your own version of it? It's also around that time that the focus on services was completely abandoned. Ubuntu 1 didn't exist. By that point, Ubuntu had abandoned that, but they started wanting to build an everything OS that would run on virtually every single type of device. So they had Ubuntu Phone in mind with an actual kind of successful but also not reaching its goal campaign for an Ubuntu Phone that looked really well, that I backed back in the day. They also wanted Ubuntu on TVs with a specific experience. They had a version of Ubuntu for netbooks. They had a version of Ubuntu in mind for tablets. Basically, they wanted to expand Ubuntu to every single device category. And the Unity era continued. This is what I would call the nothing era. From 14.10 up to basically 17.10, nothing happened at all for Ubuntu. They tried doing a few things, like doing the worst of both worlds with, instead of having a global menu bar always at the same place, they placed it in the window title bar, which why would you ever want that instead of having either a normal menu bar or a global menu bar? I don't know. Fortunately, you could disable that because why would you not? They also introduced snap packages for the first time around these days. They had moved to the GNOME Software Center by then, replacing their own Ubuntu Software Center that was super old, super slow, and very long in the tooth. But they also started implementing stuff related to their snap packages, which started as Ubuntu Phone packages, also called Click packages. But basically, for almost 3 years of Ubuntu, nothing really changed. Unity was refined, it looked better, it worked better, but it never really evolved, and Ubuntu kept focusing on other things, saying that they would bring all the stuff that they learned to the desktop, but it never happened. And they basically abandoned every project that they had worked on that was on the desktop or the server by the time 17.10 was released. Ubuntu 17.10 was the I give up release, basically. They moved to GNOME 3, they dropped Unity, they had Unity 7, which was the one you saw in this video, and Unity 8, which was a brand new effort aimed at unifying Unity for all devices. They completely gave up on all of that, and they decided to move to GNOME 3, which at that point, I will admit, was absolutely serviceable and worked great, even though a lot of people still didn't like what it tried to do. Ubuntu implemented it in a competent way. But they also dropped everything that made Ubuntu Ubuntu. They went from being the best desktop distro out there with their own identity to being just another GNOME distro. And all of their own projects were completely abandoned by that point either. No more TV and tablet efforts, no more their own software center, no more trying to have paid apps in the software center, which they actually did first a long while back, no more Mir display server, nothing. The only piece that remains of that entire era is basically snaps, which is the only part that people really did not want to survive. So yeah, it was a disaster, and by that point I had lost complete interest in Ubuntu because I felt they had just shot themselves in the foot repeatedly, and they were just not a good offering for a desktop. That entire GNOME era from basically 17.10 up to 22.04 was, I think, the saddest era for Ubuntu. They basically brought nothing in terms of enhancements. They reintroduced features that they had before, like desktop icons. They tweaked the theme here and there, but basically the only thing they did was work on their snap packages and add some extensions to GNOME and tweak the theme and the background. They just barely kept up with actual GNOME versions, and they actually were a mishmash of versions for applications that were not updated at the same rate or at the same time, which means some stuff was just completely out of date. You had libraries everywhere that were just not coherent. It was not a good platform to use. And it was sad because Ubuntu had been the best operating system for desktops for a long time. They had brought the Linux desktop into the light. They had made it what it was. And these days they just kept basically coasting. They kept some of the improvements of GNOME, tried to theme them, and that was about it. Ubuntu had completely lost its desktop crown. I even stopped recommending it to newcomers by that point because you couldn't even find reliable information on what it used, the versions of the apps from GNOME that it used, the tweaks they applied. It was a mess. It was a mishmash of mixed versions of stuff. It just did not work properly. It crashed quite a lot in my testing. Those were the dark days of Ubuntu. But from that era rose a new Ubuntu, one that a lot of people do not like, but one that has focus again. And the focus is we're gonna build our own app distribution infrastructure on top of the Ubuntu base. We're not going to try to rebuild a brand new desktop. What we have with GNOME and extensions works, but we're gonna try to build our own infrastructure for developers to distribute apps and for users to use them. And that's with snaps. The format has received a ton of work. It is now not nearly as bad as it once was, even though it's still not my favorite personally. They have a brand new installer for the distro, which looks and works really well. They have a brand new software center, which is actually quite good now that it's actually able to install deb packages. They have improved the desktop with tiling plugins. They have their new security center that is seeing the light of day. They are working on bringing encryption to the desktop. They have a permission system for the snaps, and they even started their Ubuntu Core Desktop project, which is an immutable snap-based distro that actually looks really good on paper because every part of the system is an independent snap, so you could run bleeding-edge desktop sessions on super stable basis, and you could still manage every app individually. It looks like the best of both worlds for at least Snap users. So Ubuntu definitely is starting to regain some of its lost prestige on the desktop, at least if you don't hate snaps and what Ubuntu is doing with it. I will admit, this is not my preferred format, but I can see where they're going with this, and I can appreciate the work that they've put behind it and the reasoning. In the end, Ubuntu has a history full of twists and turns. It started a revolution in the Linux desktop, and it made it what it is today, or at least it very heavily contributed to it. If Ubuntu hadn't come around, I am not sure the desktop for Linux would be that polished today. Before Ubuntu, desktop distros really sucked. You can't imagine how much they blew. Ubuntu fixed or helped fix a lot of those issues. But then they got too big for their boots and they started acting like a startup without the billions in funding that they would need to tackle all the markets that they wanted to expand into. The TV, the tablet, the smartphone markets, all about 2 to 3 years too late. Microsoft didn't manage to do it while spending billions on Windows Phone. Ubuntu had zero chance, and they should have recognized that outright and focused on the desktop and not on a myriad of projects that would never come to fruition. And it's not just hindsight. Everyone knew at the time this had zero chance of succeeding. It was completely mismanaged. And it took them years to recover and rebuild a desktop strategy that one can see emerging now. It's the snap-based strategy, but it's still a desktop strategy that some people appreciate and like. I still have a lot of love and respect for Ubuntu. It's the distro that introduced me to Linux back in 2006, and without it, I'm pretty sure this channel would not exist, and I really would not like computers at all, very likely. So yeah, thanks Ubuntu for bringing me into this world. You're not the distro I use now, but I do use stuff that is based on you. Your direction might not be the one I want to follow you in, but I understand what you're doing with it, and I think you're finally climbing up that slope that you fell down since you decided to drop Unity. Now, bring back the Unity desktop as the default and the theme from Lucid Links, and I will be probably your most fervent supporter, honestly. Just like I am our sponsor's most fervent supporter. It's Tuxedo Computers. They make laptops and desktops that ship with Linux out of the box. And they actually develop the drivers needed to make all of that stuff work. It's all open source, and they're even in the process of relicensing them so they can be upstreamed as GPLv2 inside of the Linux kernel. They have a big range of computers that will suit every need and every price point. And I only use Tuxedo Computers to do everything, my whole channel, podcast, and everything is run on one of their laptops, and all my gaming needs are served on one of their desktops sitting right underneath the desk where I'm recording this. So if you need a new computer, you want to support Linux, you want to support a company that actively contributes to Linux, you have a link in the description to check out Tuxedo computers. They are really good. In the meantime, thank you all for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't hesitate to like, to subscribe, to turn on notifications. You know how things work. And if you really enjoyed the channel, there are plenty of links down in the description as well, so you can support it financially and you'll get a bunch of perks in the process. So thanks for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!